This video presents and illuminates a program development and program evaluation approach based upon the Indigenous framework of the 7 directions. I invite you to enter this space and experience this video with reverence and respect. The 7 directions framework is the cultural knowledge of the Stockbridge-Munsee, Lunaape communities and nations, as shared by Dr. Nicole Bowman, traditional community member and citizen. To set the appropriate tone and context for this video, Nikki Bowman offers a traditional blessing centered around the 7 directions, followed by her explanation of the history and use of the 7 directions for program design, evaluation, and reflection. Here is the blessing.
Anishik Kishalamokwe Alamiliang Lapi Anishik Alamiliang. Thank you again, Creator, for giving me Yon Kwai Kishkwik Walk Nimu Wakanam for my whole life and for this day. Into the 7 directions I say Anishik, 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 Anishik. Aho.
The video opens with Dr. Nicole Bowman explaining the nature, origin, and substance of the 7 directions teachings, followed by a case example of applying the 7 directions. The case example is from a program in Tempe, Arizona, supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. This video in the 7 directions is an exploration of the connections between climate and health in a community-based, arts-enhanced, and youth-focused approach to equitable urban cooling and emergency management in Tempe. We begin with Dr. Bowman presenting the 7 directions framework.
In the frame of communication strategies about this and how you can use decolonized data visualization and reporting and things like that to talk about the human health and well-being and climate nexus, if you will, to speak about that. We are the Aina, as my Native Hawaiian relatives reminded me. We are the land, especially for Indigenous people. We're the land, we're relatives, and getting out of it's all about the humans approach is really sort of fundamental to the work that we're doing. My work comes out of traditional teachings which have timeless meaning. This is a picture of our creation story, and you could use it for theory, you could use it for practice and analytical framework, lots. But it shows systems evaluation. It shows how we are one human in relation and coming from the sky world. Grandmother Moon and grandfather Sun had a baby named Mother Earth. And I am a child of Mother Earth. And so you'll see a lot of our teachings come out of this, and to remember our relationship to the land and to the resources, sky, earth, water. Phase 1, January to June, we started with the 4 directions medicine wheel framework, and you can see a content analysis of key documents that Claire gave to us. We did a literature scan, and we had grantee engagement. We also had a technical advisory group that sort of informed our, what we thought our model was going to be into what you see in phase 2. And so at the start of phase 2, we moved from a 4 directions model to a 7 directions. So not only did it include the teachings and the teachings and the way we defined east, south, west, and north, it also addressed earthward direction, skyward direction, and inward direction. That 7th direction is inward, and really getting more deeply into what does it mean to think about the human health and well-being and climate, the nexus of that. The change starts with us. And I always say it's the longest journey that we're on, even though it's the shortest distance to go inward, because you really got to rethink about your ethics and values and what is that, how does it express itself, practically, whether we're working or playing, wherever we might be, whatever context we're in. And so we move that down into this phase 2, which is started in June. and it goes through this May, and we deepen the grantee engagement, talk to them about the 7 directions model. We have a grantee case example, grantee voices saying what were the local voices saying so that it could inform our work about this nexus. And you will see the healthy directions framework as it stands now, which is the bottom bubble. We took a while to put this document together. It comes from our 7 directions teachings. It was applied to during phase 1 and phase 2, and it kept being refined, not only by our grantees, but we had a beautiful technical advisory group, some of the who's who on the planet dealing, who are the natural and hard sciences, not just a social scientist like myself. So we had a lot of, it was a very participatory and authentic process. The Eastern direction, we focus on relationships between all human beings and non-human relatives, as we would say. Southern direction looks at mindsets and mental models. Theories could fit in there, frameworks. Western direction examines movement in the decisions and actions and behaviors of humans that impact the environment and all of the other living relatives. Northern direction centers the future building and intergenerational ethics towards realizing a vision, because the decisions we make now will affect beyond our grandbabies it will affect. The earthward direction grounds us in the timeless knowledge and wisdom of Kukuna Aki, Mother Earth, and thinking about how do we be healthy and sustainable. The skyward direction, where we all come from and where we all return to in my cultural framing, reminds us not only of the wind, right, and the air quality. You see the moon cycles on there and how the moon moves the tides and the seasons. She has a big push on us. It's about the sun. Are we getting too much, too little? The ozone, all of those things. And it reminds us to elevate our consciousness and the moral understanding that we have from a perspective of past, present, and future. So that skyward direction. And then the inward direction is your introspection and personal growth. How do I as an individual make these changes so it can affect my life, my family, my community, and beyond? Balance in relationships. Instead of good or bad, our elders teach us that nothing is good or bad, which is sort of weird, right? Because we're evaluators. We should have an opinion. We say everything our teachers is what our elders say. And when things feel weird, rough, or have gaps, that just means things are out of balance. So that's sort of how we framed having a balanced or imbalanced relationship. And then you can see from the 7 directions how we sort of break that down.
So Nikki has laid out the 7 directions framework that is the basis for this reflective evaluation exercise. We're going to use a case example in order to go more deeply into what the 7 directions mean in practice, to illustrate the reflective framework that 7 directions offers. The project that we're going to review was not developed based on the 7 directions, but in reviewing what they did, the co-leads, Katja Brundiers and Paul Cosio from the Arizona State University, cooperating with the City of Tempe Office of Sustainability and Resilience, used the 7 directions to describe and reflect on what they had experienced. And what we did with them was to help look at how the 7 directions gives insight into what they did and shares some of their reactions to using the 7 directions as a way of reflecting on what they did and what they accomplished. Charmaine is going to describe their project, and then we're going to briefly take you through what each of the 7 directions illuminates about their work together.
So the Cool Kids, Cool Places, Cool Futures project was led by the City of Tempe in Arizona and is a community-based, arts-enhanced, and youth-focused initiative seeking to address climate change, health, and equity issues. And it was conducted as a community city university partnership supported in part by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and other organizations. And the goal of the project was to transform the approach of building resilience to extreme heat from thinking of it as an individual responsibility into more of a collective responsibility for community resilience to extreme heat. So we're going to walk through the different directions, the 7 directions, and talk about how they were reflected in the project. So the Eastern direction focuses on relations between all beings, human and more than human. And within the relationships, they prioritize the relationships with youth and with Indigenous creatives and artists. And so they really looked at how those relationships supported the project. And as they were reflecting on the Eastern direction, it really illuminated that beyond those important relationships, they really did look at the additional systems and interrelations that they had with the natural environment and across different departments within the city. So the Office of Emergency Management, Sustainability, and Resilience. And they learned that within these interconnections, that in order to build better relationships going forward, they really needed to unlearn certain ways that the different relationships worked and forge new relationships. And so looking at the focus on relationships really expanded how they understood the project to be more of a systems approach that not just with individual youth and artists, but more of a systems with the natural environment and the organizational systems within which they were working.
Part of what's important about the Eastern direction for both planning and evaluation is that traditional logic models and theories of change in evaluation tend to look at the activities that are done and the concrete outcomes that a project is aiming at. But what the Eastern direction highlights is that those activities and outcomes depend upon relationships. And in our work together in evaluation, we regularly find that a major factor in the success of projects, when they are successful, is that they attend to and nurture relationships. The Eastern direction then, in the 7 directions, really highlights for planners and evaluators and people doing projects to attend to and document the nature and importance of relationships. In their reflective report, the Tempe staff commented on the Eastern direction.
We prioritize the relationships with youth because youth will inherit the legacy of decisions we make today, and they see the urgency to act as they fear there will not be a livable future. We really wanted to collaborate with youth and mobilize the strength of young people for community resilience.
So then we move down into the Southern direction, which explores mindsets and mental models. And within the project, they had 2 primary frameworks that informed their thinking. So on one hand, they had a goal-oriented concept, which really focused on transforming responsibility to protect against heat from individual to collective, as we said. And so when they looked at what that meant, it meant that they were really thinking about what would a collective obligation for community resilience to extreme heat look like at the end of their project. And they had very ambitious aspirations for the project to move the needle on social dimensions, so increasing racial equity, social cohesion, and neighborhood justice, environmental dimensions, mitigating climate change and heat, and then economic dimensions, so allocating more funds to both citywide infrastructure projects that reduce heat, as well as household-facing projects that support energy equity. But then when they were thinking about working to transform from individual and collective, it was also really about different processes and the ways of working together, which connects back to those relationships. And so rather than only focusing on the goals, they also looked at the processes that they used and how those were also important and really critical to the way that the project unfolded. And so those included community-based, arts-enhanced, and youth-focused, which also required an intergenerational and intercultural lens. And so they really thought about this as how equitable access to clean and affordable energy ensured that they recognized the injustices that disadvantaged communities had to access energy, and those that have been historically marginalized and overburdened by things like pollution and underinvestment, and really needing to address those systemic issues through relationships and through changed processes, in addition to just focusing on the more measurable outcomes. And so this goal-oriented and process-oriented ways of thinking came together and were illuminated by the Southern direction that really helped to illuminate what the thinking was behind the project.
In the report, the Tempe staff wrote about the Southern direction.
Well, the integration of social, environmental, and economic issues would, for example, manifest in the energy equity projects. The energy equity projects provided funds for retrofitting homes and installing appliances to be more energy efficient in cooling, as well as funds to access clean energy. This latter one contributes to healthy environment, and the funds go primarily to households with high vulnerability to heat that contributes to social justice. And as the funds are designed to reduce the future need of energy and thus contribute to keeping energy bills manageable, they contribute to the economic health of the city as well as of households. We tried to be really intentional about this idea of integration of social, environmental, and economic issues. This meant that we did take the time to think through all of these dimensions of a project, whether it was an energy equity project or a tree planting project or building a new transit shelter. Protecting people from heat was the overarching goal of the project, and we wanted to do this protection in ways that we can also contribute to social justice, environmental health, and economic viability.
Part of what's important about the Southern direction, again, for evaluation in general, is that, as we noted around relationships, evaluation that does logic models and theories of change tends to deal with the formal way that projects are conceptualized. But the Southern direction really calls our attention to thinking in action, not just what is conceptualized. In many projects, the people that design the logic models or a theory of change aren't the ones who are actually implementing the project. And so there's a disconnect between the formal conceptualization and the actual thinking in action. What the Southern direction highlights is to get at what are the driving conceptualizations in practice. We know that systems change very much depends upon the narrative that undergirds the system, that explains how systems operate and what their effects are. The Southern direction spotlights that thinking in action, as Charmaine described how the project attended to the way in which they were engaging with the different people as who are part of the project. That thinking is critical.
As part of our collaborative efforts, we did engage in a joint conversation about what good thinking means. And these insights take us back to the role of building relationships so that these conversations can actually yield shared understanding and convergence.
So now moving into the Western direction, we really look more at the actions, the decisions, and the behaviors of the humans that impact the environment and each other. And what the program really found was that they had taken a people-centric approach to their programming. And so some of the examples of that were that in the Office of Emergency Management, one of the things that they did was they distributed HEAT READY packs. READY stands for Resilience, Engagement, Action, Dedication, and Inclusion. And when they executed this action, it really shed light on improvement potential of the people-centric approach.
The Tempe project staff reflections on the Western directions in their report include this comment.
The example with the Heat Ready pack illustrates our project's team's need to become keenly aware of intersecting vulnerabilities and how to develop actions that carefully take these intersections into account while also addressing the structural drivers of vulnerabilities. Reflecting on this example illuminated several important insights. First, none of the so-called key actions are just one action. They required many actions to happen before. For example, coordinating meetings, requesting approvals, preparing materials, and also follow-up activities. Thinking carefully about the sequence of actions illuminated the connection between actions and relationships. And we began to recognize that actions can either foster relationships or break relationships, and we have experienced both. And we also realized that you need to have relationships in order to engage in actions and to build the collective movement that we were hoping to generate. So this really echoes what we learned from reflecting on the Eastern direction, which highlighted that the quality of the relationship influences the quality of our actions.
They also held Regional Resilience Celebration, which deliberately was designed to turn the tables and really put the power in the hands of community groups who presented their initiatives to the city staff, decision makers, and elected officials. So this was really about flipping the way that relationships were done in action to help empower those who are often not listened to. And then green infrastructure development, the yellow cog there, they really looked at how to change the infrastructure to be more green. They conducted a public heat walk to measure heat in places with and without GSI, and then they green infrastructure. And then they also implemented several projects that were cooling projects through tree planting events and looking at city-owned properties and local schools. And then in the red cog, the policymaking aspect of their action, they facilitated a series of workshops between city staff and scholars and scientists that then they co-created heat vulnerability and equity maps and conducted heat assessments of plans to think about how the various city plans and policies connect and try to really cross silos so that they were not seen as distinct from one another, but really connected, particularly as they impacted communities around heat. So when they looked at these three different types of action, the programming, the infrastructure, and the policy making together, again, they return to that idea of relationships and really tried to think about how they can become more keenly aware of the intersecting vulnerabilities and relationships and really carefully take those into account when addressing things at any level, and really to think about how to really localize what they were doing and make sure that it was really rooted in the place and history in which they were working.
An example of this place-based focus from the Tempe report.
To support the expansion of the green infrastructure development in the city of Tempe, we focused on green stormwater infrastructure, also called the rain to roots infrastructure. This infrastructure is green as it purposefully uses natural vegetation, soil, and topography to mimic nature and capture rainwater when it falls. The green stormwater infrastructure reduces and cleans stormwater at its source while also providing community benefits, including reducing localized flooding, storing water, and cooling the environment.
The 7 directions is founded upon the medicine wheel, which views, as Charmaine was saying, things in relationship to each other. It's a circular, interactive set of relationships among the directions, rather than the traditional Western way of thinking of things in linear cause and effect terms. So that, as Charmaine was saying, the Western direction looks at actions, decisions, and behaviors, but in connection to those all involve relationships and ways of thinking about what they're doing, so that relationships, conceptualization, thinking, and actions are integrated, and those together lead to the importance of the final direction.
So Then we move into the northern direction, which centers future building and intergenerational ethics towards realizing a vision for the next 7 generations. And within this direction, when they were thinking about how this work will carry forward and what they can take on to future generations, the project team came up with some principles for city youth collaboration that were then presented by youth fellows to the city of Tempe. And so this is how what the project learned can be taken forward for future collaborations. And those principles were: be intentional with youth representation and inclusion in conversations, and ensure that changes come about as a result of their input, and beyond a performative role, but really ensuring that those that intentional engagement of youth is authentic. Then to establish expectations for youth and community guidelines at the very beginning of their involvement in a program, and to really generate a productive and comfortable environment. So to really monitor what's happening over time and identify moments and milestones throughout the engagement process where consultative versus directive decision-making would be observed, being mindful of the expectations within those spaces. The third principle was to be open about governance structures and willing to educate students, utilizing approaches like design thinking, arts, and culture as a way to really share power and make spaces more open and engaging to young people. And then the fourth was to involve multiple youth. So instead of just dedicating one student representative, ensuring that they have their own community within the broader board or engagement opportunity, so that they can affirm one another's participation and feelings of excitement or frustration, and build accountability and a sense of shared ownership. And then finally, to apply an equity lens. So youth value viewing sustainability through the lens of equity, and it involves recognizing the intersectional identities that everyone has as individuals and how that affects their relationship with climate change.
The Tempe staff reflected on the principles as follows.
As a result of working in our project over several years, the partnership has received a set of principles for collaboration from diverse groups, from youth collaborators, the HECU Artist Continuum, and a group of NGOs. The core project team has then taken these principles for collaboration to heart and formulated a new way of working for the city to work with youth, local neighborhoods, and regional organizations, and also across scale, from touch to neighborhood to city and regional scales.
The principles that were generated are especially appropriate when one is thinking about the future and the long-term future, the sustainable future, 7 generations, not just a 5-year time frame. But when you're looking out into the future, it's not possible to specify in detail exactly what activities are going to be conducted in the future. And so principles are especially appropriate for thinking about how to engage with the long-term future, building upon the past, acknowledging what's going on in the present, but having out of those experiences a set of principles to guide in the future. And principles-focused evaluation then emerges as a way to evaluate the meaningfulness of these principles to people, their adherence to them, and where the principles take them. So it's a way of engaging with the northern direction that is coherent and aligned with future-oriented thinking. Those principles then guide relationships. The Eastern Door, they guide ways of thinking about the future. The Southern Door, they guide activities that are going on. The Western Door, and they provide a commitment to realizing a vision for the next 7 generations.
So we walked through the 4 directions that were inspired by the medicine wheel. These next 3 directions take us outside of that to more of our 3D Earth perspective, whole Earth perspective and looking specifically starting with rooting in the earthward direction, which grounds us in the timeless wisdom, experiential knowledge, and sustainability needs rooted in and through our relationship with Mother. And when looking at the earthward direction, the project really focused on the urban landscape and how heat impacts the places where people live and play and work every day, as well as the corridors and public places that connect those. So houses, schools, office buildings, as well as roads and transit lines. And the project measured how the areas in the city heat up and store the heat and radiate it back into the environment, and how hot these areas are. And so the figure that's shown here illustrates the different scales of heat and hot spots. And the project really framed the challenges of heat for people as composed around places and those corridors. And so the question, when they were asked to reflect on the earthward direction, really reminded the team of the intrinsic values of the natural environment beyond the benefit of humans. So while they were really focused on how the heat impacts the humans in their community, they were really drawn back to the importance of supporting the environment itself and respecting not just one another, but respecting the environment and the earth and the quality of the land, and recognizing that the quality of human and social well-being depends on the health and well-being of the land, and seeing those as mutually beneficial.
The reflective question offered through the earthward direction reminded us of the intrinsic values of the natural environment beyond the benefit it provides to humans, which are also called environmental services. It is not just about respect for each other, but also towards the environment, the land, and the quality of the land. The quality of humans and social well-being depends on the health of the land.
Tempe staff commented on the earthward direction.
While these efforts were done to build community resilience, we engaged with less detail around questions about how heat impacts the well-being of plants and animals, which influences community resilience too. Nevertheless, project partners working on living more in these environmental spaces reminded us about it. For instance, the urban foresters shared stories of tree health drawing parallels to human heat illness, such as heat stroke, and thus raising awareness for the suffering of trees and vegetation dying from prolonged heat exposure. The impacts of heat on the land have an even bigger meaning and hence consequence, as Tempe is situated in the Salt River Valley on ancestral territories of Indigenous peoples, including the Akimal Ordam and Piposh and Paskayaki tribes. The Hekyu Artist Continuum did introduce to us a holistic view of how heat impacts people because it impacts the whole natural environment.
The importance of the earthward direction has been taking on greater significance as we face issues of sustainability, regeneration, and resilience of the natural environment going forward. And this is affirmed by a group of international evaluators on Earth Day in 2024 who adopted a resolution that all evaluations should address the way in which whatever is going on looks at the relationships with nature, with the environment, with ecosystems, and their sustainability. And so the 7 directions, including the earthward direction, is very vision-oriented toward recognizing that projects don't happen in a closed context, but that projects are related to whatever's going on in the larger ecosystem.
The 6th direction is the skyward direction, which encourages the elevation of consciousness and moral understanding, urging a broadened perspective that connects past, present, and future, but also thinks about the air and the broader environment beyond the land in which we're all living. And when they initially considered the skyward direction, they really thought about that air and air quality and how that was somewhat missing from their original project. So issues of air and air quality are really important in Phoenix. The air is very poor, but despite that, the project didn't have time to focus on that in detail. And so they really thought about how they might be able to connect their work to that in the future. And that thinking about environmental justice as the entry point for the project and the interconnections between environmental and social dimensions, such as the polluted air and endangered natural environments, they weren't able to prioritize those as much as the project went forward. And so being able to reflect back on the skyward direction helped them to see how they could do more to integrate the various components of environmental justice in their project in the future. And so they offered a quote about how working through the 7 directions healthy journey framework, we realize that we have a great opportunity to continue working to reconnect with earth and sky in the ways proposed in this framework, as guided by the Oidbad, Original Peoples Design Principles.
This builds on the origin stories indigenously of the relationship between Mother Earth and Father Sky to direct our attention then in any and all evaluations to the earth and all living things and the air, the water, the substances that are part of our survival as a species and the humanity and living things on earth. So again, it provides a comprehensive thinking about the context within which any given project takes place. And that 7th direction takes us from the larger context into our more immediate personal context.
So the inward direction focuses on introspection and personal growth, highlighting the importance of confronting and reconciling personal histories, biases, and experiences. And it really calls us to consider the inner transformations as part of the project's journey. So they recognize that although they were trying to transition from the individual to collective responsibility, they can't take the individual out of that collective responsibility, that it's really a clear-rooted part of it. And we're able to recognize that most of the folks working on the project really did transform individually through their work on the project, in addition to the folks who were involved in the project. And gained a really deep awareness of how to translate the things that they were learning into their daily practice. So that meant that they became more vulnerable and really developed those deeper connections, kind of circling back to the relationships that will be sustained. And so bringing that deeper awareness of the issues with a mindfulness and vulnerability allowed them to develop those deeper connections. And there's one quote which illuminates this transformation. As a new city employee, I'm so proud to be a part of a municipality who centers equity, holistic engagement, and prioritizes youth. The fact that we pursued this grant with these cross-cutting objectives is admirable. I'm honored to be a trusted adult in youth spaces, as this is required to make any real progress. And really, the recognition of the importance of those connections and the importance of sustaining them over time is evident in many of the different things that were developed through this project, and shows how the inward transformation connects to the outward transformation.
The inward direction also breaks down another barrier that traditional evaluation has established, where the focus is on the official outcomes and goals of a project and the activities to achieve those, but does not typically include the reflective practice of how the individuals involved are changing, not just at the end, but along the way, as they engage in decision-making, build relationships, come to understand the narrative that they're engaged with as they carry out activities, And so what we've learned is that in comprehensive efforts that are going to be sustainable, the individual reflective practice, the individual transformation is another part of the process that's important to document and to provide evaluation processes, as this project did, for people to come together and reflect on what happened to them individually, what happened to them as a team, and how that will affect what they do in the future.
Overall, working through the 7 Directions Healthy Journey framework, we realized that we have a great opportunity to continue working to reconnect with Earth and Sky in the ways proposed in the 7 Directions Healthy Journey framework and as guided by the Oitbart Original People Design Principles.
So the systems perspective here that this project offers has multiple levels. It is centered in the place of Tempe, Arizona, within the United States, but within a global dynamic world where what's happening on global warming, on the pollution of earth, land, and air, the pandemic, global issues of equity, migration, immigration, that these larger factors become the context for what goes on locally. And that the 7 Directions invite us to take this comprehensive view from a systems perspective at multiple levels. From a place-based perspective, we inhabit a local place. We are a part of Mother Earth and Father Sky. And so the final framing of this that the 7 Directions bring forward is the relationship between health, climate, culture, and place. What's come to be called evaluating at the nexus, the intersection of place, Tempe, Arizona, of health patterns and disparities, of community engagement, of climate and ecosystem trends, of looking at nature, both humanity and all living things, which leads to the culture of health and well-being. And so it connects place, health, climate, culture together through the lens of the 7 Directions. It opens up a circular, interdependent, interactive, complex systems dynamic way of engaging with projects, which is captured in this graphic that Nikki introduced us to in the first part of this presentation. And we leave you to reflect on that intersection of the 7 Directions captured in this graphic image.